See, the true magician doesn't want any repression. But didn't we say that the coping mechanism of the superego has to repress their anxiety? If you don't have that repressing anxiety sensor, anxiety will flood into your being. But that's what the magician says is necessary for you to have. And we go, what? The unrepressed soul won't just have a little bit of free-floating anxiety that I spoke of, the little leftover part, which is already disabling enough. The magician is telling you to open the floodgates. Face the rage and the fear. Don't have the censor. And unleash from yourself all the anxiety that's within you. That's the purgation he's asking for. You think the human race is going to go for that after we've gone to the length of importing the whole fucking crowd into our head and strengthening the superego? Well, the magical path is saying you should have no repression whatsoever. Let it all out. But when you have a technique for doing that, like Wilhelm Reich formed, Alexander Lowen, Arthur Yanov, we don't want to know. We pillory those guys. Aleister Crowley, Osho, anyone who even tries to dabble in those things and suggest those things. We are so petrified by that rage. That's why the superego came in to repress it. It's so huge that we are scared of what will happen to us if it ever comes to the surface. So we just deny it and say, denial of denial. I can't let this through. Mm-hmm. So we rather remain toxic. We rather remain infirm.
Hello and welcome. My name is Matty, and this is the next episode of Vocation. Once again, I'm very pleased to announce I'm joined by the great Michael Tsarion, and we're going to be carrying on our conversation from last time regarding the occult. Just first off, how are you doing this week, Michael? You keeping all right? Everything going well?
Oh, yes, very well. Thank you very much. I was looking forward to this. Thank you very much for inviting me back.
Yeah, awesome. Pleasure to have you. And so we'll just start again, pick up a little bit from where we were last time. We spoke a little bit about these three different ages. So I've got a little presentation once again. I thought we'll maybe just pivot off that and work from some of the themes that come up from there. But just again, for the audience, a lot of this is coming from Michael's article, which again, we'll leave a link down below regarding the occult and about Aleister Crowley. And so without further ado, let me just call up this little image you sent me last time. So these were the three ages we were speaking about regarding the occult. It was the pre-Adamite age, the bicameral age, and the moral universe. Can you walk us through a little bit again, Michael, just what the main differences were about these three ages and roughly when were they once again?
Well, yes, of course. This pertains to the way that I look at this very subject matter that we're talking about. I think it's a helpful little key to address, because remember, this is a vast subject that we're talking about. The history of the occult really is something very, very deep, and normally, volumes could be written about it. So how does one condense it? This is the difficulty. And so after many, many years, this is the sort of the key that I like to use, which is that, as we spoke before, it's ridiculous of us. I mean, you read this Lawrence Gardner quote before, which is so pertinent. And even though he expressed it in his own way, there's a lot of logic to what he was saying there about the fiction of our times and our modern technology. And we don't think about the prehistoric period, the background, and we don't think of the accelerated pace of our own developments in technology and what have you. And we need to factor that in at all times. And when you really do seriously think about it, then you've obviously got to go, many thousands of years ago, before 12,000, when we know that 12,000 BC, this would be when major cataclysms took place. And take up the idea of certain catastrophists, and other theorists who talk about this pre-Adamic world. And we have to really kind of conceive of that world. But even though that may be difficult, and it is difficult, at least we can all agree on one thing. Something happened to it. It doesn't exist anymore. There was a tribulation, there was catastrophic events took place, and so whatever world existed back then in this pre-Adamic or pre-Adamite world, it's lost to us. So then we looked at that, we factored that in as one of these plausible keys to say, hey, is the occult then? Well, even as religion then, what we know as religion, what we know as, say, magic, what we know as mysticism, these kinds of things that the pragmatist laughs at, that the scientist laughs at, but is there an underlying meaning that they have missed? And it is the piecing together, haphazard as that is, of a bygone epoch and a bygone gnosis. And because it was shattered, and because it's lost, and because we're not very good at it, it has taken, these different manifestations. Religion is one way of approaching it, but then look how, diverse religions are. There's certainly not just one religion in the world that has its attitude about how to go about this. Look at the magical sciences. Those seem to be very varied. You get the high version, and we know that that was even practiced by not just the Marsilio Ficinos and the Pico della Mirandolas and the Cornelius Agrippas, but perhaps even by people like Leonardo da Vinci and others. And then you've got your more pure mysticism, which again has its own approach to this, and that's very multifarious. You even have you have esoteric Christianity, which is mystical in its way. You've got mystical Islam, which would turn up in something like Sufism, and you've got it in the Far East, and you certainly have it in the West. So what are all of these things? What are they all doing? So I always put this in my work, and when you look into the works of, and you mentioned before Colin Wilson's great book on the occult, and he even wrote one on Aleister Crowley, you're quite right. When you factor in, say, the work of Manly Palmer Hall, for instance, or, Evelyn Underhill, or works by Aleister Crowley, McGregor Mathers, people like that, A.E. Waite, Eliphas Levi. When you look at all of these works, it kind of starts to make sense. Now, what happens with the left brain type person is that they only see the holes. They only see the flaws. They expect perfection. And so when they scan this world of the mystic and the magician and the occult, they come away sort of laughing, as if they expected it to be framed in this perfect way, not understanding this theory of a lost world, of a lost time, and perhaps severe psychological trauma that went with it. And then even maybe some even guilt factors. There's a lot of things we could talk about here, right? The guilt of the survivor, it's known, right? When there's a great cataclysm, like say a big ship goes down, or like 9/11, remember 9/11, right? And those survivors have to actually go see psychologists because they have a thing called guilt complex, survivor guilt. Why did it happen to the guy right next to me? They have this, soldiers in the trenches, soldiers and warrior. How did the guy right beside me, inches away, get the bullet and I didn't?
Titanic.
And they come back completely traumatized. Can we imagine that on a mass level? Or even if it wasn't that kind of trauma, some other kind of trauma that maybe psychology hasn't even really grasped yet? Something incredible?
Yeah, and so I'll head on to this next little slide here, Michael, and we'll sort of, there's a few to go through, so we'll maybe just work our way through those. So initially we were speaking about these different ages, the pre-Adamite age, the bicameral age, and the moral universe. So yeah, just to focus on these different ages a little bit. Again, this is a quote from your article. Now this speaks about the Ion of Horus, which is the age that we're moving into. And so you write here, imagery of Arcanum 20 in the Thodaro, which we went through last time, and it'll come up in a little second again. This is based on the essence of what Crowley received from his guide. Following in the footsteps of Christian mystic Jacopo Fiore, he wrote how history had a Trinitarian structure. Specifically, there are three great epochs corresponding to the three periods of the so-called Platonic cycle. This is this cycle of about 26,000 years that gets broken down into the zodiac. The first epoch, which Crowley named Ion of Isis, was a period of matriarchies which allegedly terminated around 255 BC. During this age, societies were predominantly eccentric, egalitarian, and pantheistic. The superseding period was that of the Ion of Osiris, an age of patriarchal communities which maintained dominion until approximately 1900 AD. The present Ion of Horus, therefore, is a period of the sovereign individual, the son or child of creation, and as with any period of birth, the age has seen several traumatic events. Like Blake, Tennyson, and Nietzsche before him, Crowley predicted the world wars and tribulations he believed were unfortunately necessary for the true spirit of freedom to rise from the ashes of corrupt, outworn, old world systems. As Christopher Hyatt puts it, the Ion of Osiris was an age of terrible darkness, of deplorable ignorance, and of abominable superstition. And so, again, this is card 20 from the Thoth Darrow, and just one last little sort of comment on it, and I'll pass it back to you, Michael. Again, this is from your article. In each age, say Theosophists and Thelemites, the spirit of Horus the Liberator returns. Once every 2,000 years, the archetype manifests to destroy the dark satanic mills, which is a callback to Blake's work, I believe. And in other words, the spirit of Horus is the spirit of rebellion that takes birth in certain iconoclastic men and women who, as society's artists, poets, musicians, writers, and activists, actively push for reform and justice. The spirit of rebellion shakes traditional paradigms and brings radical change to individuals and countries. It also brings change to religious ideas and beliefs. And so, does that sound like the modern age that we're in now, this spirit of Horus, the spirit of the liberator, as what we're going through is a breakdown of old times and there's a whole new paradigm that's coming forward our way? Is that kind of how you see it, Michael, or what's your sort of overview of that?
Well, right. What Christopher Hyatt said there is very important. This age of darkness is then what it connects with what I was saying about this golden age of the pre-Adamic. When that passed away, we not only had shards of the gnosis, but it was, as one author puts it, just a dust had gathered, and all that remains was dusty relics. And it's like going into an old cave or grotto, and you do see some books and you do see some scrolls, but as you reach out to touch them, they crumble to dust in your hands. And so you're in a complete state of panic. And you're thinking, my God, here are treasure troves, tunnels going on for miles and miles, but none of us can touch it. None of us has a clue. Right? Or something that's written in, ancient Sanskrit or a language unknown, hieroglyphics that have never been translated and probably couldn't be. And also this devolution in consciousness is more what we're saying. We're not the same as the people of the past golden ages, or yugas, if you will. And Crowley's little breakdown, of these three epochs that you're talking about, they're a description of what followed. He's thinking that after this great passing, we even can break down what we would call our eras into three. And that's a worthy idea. I mean, it's not the only. He wouldn't be the only person who tried that. Historians have tried this. This epochal thing. You have the great man theory of Thomas Carlyle and Hegel, and you have Oswald Spengler, and you have Sir Edward Gibbon. Vico in Italy. There's all sorts of historians that have attempted this. And it wasn't his own. He did get it, as you read, from a previous thinker, this Trinitarian approach, But the whole point was that it's a period of darkness, spiritual darkness. And we are trying to dutifully gather together what we know on some level was lost to us. And some people find that very, very difficult. So your pragmatist, materialist, positivist just goes, no, we've got our beginning new date. And that's from the, birth of Christ. That's like 2,000 years ago. Look, let's just start at zero and move forward and focus only on this modern era. If you want to use the word modern, from the beginning of Christianity, it's not totally true, but there you are. They say we can't be bothered looking back. Some people do it, but we're not finding out as much, and it wastes a lot of time. So the utilitarian way of the future, was just focus on sort of, graspable history, particularly from, say, the agricultural revolution and the industrial revolution, these important moments. And you can dip back all you like, but the further you start getting back in time, the more fragmentary it gets, the more woo-woo it gets, and the less we can prove it. So we're not really that interested in it. And this is the way it's been, until very, very recent times, actually. So, but I personally think that there's a lot of value when you start looking into the much older period that we talked about. And it's especially in this issue of what is the occult? What's actually going on there? Rather than getting into individual ceremonies and rites and rituals, that does interest some people. It doesn't interest me that much. I'm trying to look into the origins of the thing, So, yeah, and then Crowley's individual breakdown there is worth studying. He did think that astrology, maybe the movement of the planets. But the thing to grasp about what he's talking about there really is his Aeon of Horus, the period, that began in the early 20th century and has been going up to where we are now. This was what he was really emphasizing. And he wanted to let it be known that this struggle for freedom is not something people come up with in their mind on a stereotypical level. That's why he called it the Aeon of Horus. He's looking beyond the individual. He's looking beyond the stereotypical person, who he knew, like everybody else, is pretty much a conventional being, whose thinking is very much of the crowd. He knew this. He was a very great individual himself. So he wasn't looking to mankind to do this on some sort of volitional level. He knew that man has to be pushed almost to extremes. You've got to be burning. Your ass has got to be literally burning before you'll even get up and be motivated to even push for basic reforms. He knows that. He knows that's the way of history. No, he's talking about a spirit of the age, a zeitgeist, something that happens independently of a man's conscious will. The spirit of Horus, the spirit of freedom itself, pushing through from an archetypal level, sometimes against, well, more often against what people consciously want. People get into ruts, people get into role playing, people get into norms, and this happens across the board. Look at the religions, look at the mass movements. But in his thinking, he is actually convinced that despite this, whatever he channeled, whatever he saw, he thinks that despite this, there's a spirit that is trying to push through all of that against all these resistances in one's life. And so what he then believed is that we have to sort of educate people in the world into this. And he knew that although some moderns will take to this, it can be derailed very, very fast. See, he would not have approved of the hippie movements. We know this because his secretary, Israel Regardie, guaranteed us in his writings. He openly said that Crowley would not approve of any of that. Well, that Burning Man, rolling in the mud at Woodstock, any of this hippiedom was not what he was talking about, you see. So that would have been something that proponents of it would say, see, we're doing what Crowley said, do what thou wilt. No. All wrong. And he would have looked at other political movements and said, they've got it wrong as well. And he would have also said, didn't you hear what I said? You've got to break away from your traditional religious beliefs as well. In fact, this would be one of the most important breakaway things, because that was of the old Aeon of Osiris, when you had these, the patriarchal, patristic, authoritarian models. You've got to break away from those. I'm waiting, Crowley would say. So he knows that the will is not of its own volition, independently, really that interested in freedom at all, and maybe, in fact, is very threatened by it. This is what intrigued me about his work. And I think anyone who looks into his work deeply will see that this is very, very true. but he believed that man is born good and that man is a being who wants to know, sometimes despite his conditioning, and he also is a being who's seeking for meaning. But it's just that there's all these, like you and I spoke before, all these external impediments, religion being one of them. But there's also many other cultural mores and ludicrous standards, absurd stuff that also stands in the way and can waylay you and can derail you and what have you. So then he tried to sort of, somewhat like Nietzsche did. Nietzsche spoke in plenty of metaphor, and people take it for, fact in his writings, when really he was speaking sort of metaphorically or quasi-metaphorically. And Crowley's doing the same thing. He's very Nietzsche-like in his personality and in his conceptions. Crowley and Nietzsche really go together very strongly. And so even in their writing style, there is a similarity. And so these aeons that he's talking about, rather than dig around to find if there's some sort of facticity to what that's all about, I just look at it as a metaphor, as more metaphors, colorful metaphors to show you, that there is this spirit of freedom. And you can get into that, right? You could get into Jung, you could get into other sort of background theories that might explain it. But the point that Crowley's really trying to make is that this thing is resisted. It's taken many aeons and epochs for it to even manifest. The 20th and 21st century is a time when it has a likelihood, but he warned, but as it moves, this spirit of rebellion, it's going to cause devastation, and there'll be a lot of bloodletting. He understood, what these world wars were all about in his reading of things in his mind. He knew that this is not going to be easy, and there'll be a lot of tribulation as we move from one epoch to the other.
Hello. If you've been enjoying this content once again, I would really appreciate it if you would consider subscribing and liking the video as well too. It'll really help me keep this journey going. Thank you again for your time, and back to the show. Yeah, that seems like it's exactly what's happening, and we're speaking about these deeper levels in the stereotypical. We're speaking about the will of man and this kind of new will that's coming up from the unconscious, and so that brings us on to our next little slide here once again. And so when we're speaking about the will of man, again, this is a quote from your article. When men attune with the plutonic power of Horus the Liberator and inherit the freedom dreamt of, they do not become debauched and immoral, which is an important point we'll come back to. On the contrary, as Crowley emphasized, they require greater discipline and order. It is not an easy task to both obey and command one's will. This attunement with one's true will, this communion, is true holy work, requiring no churches or chapels, no oppressive hierarchies and moral codes. The standards of a malignant oppressive society inevitably condition human beings to become self-evasive and repressive. This form of cruelty against oneself was central to Crowley's insights into the human psyche and condition, and his revisioning of humanity. The unrepressed man alone is truly free. Only he has the ability and the right to free others. And so it sort of harks back to what you were saying there exactly about, this greater freedom coming through. It doesn't mean you just fall into the debauchery that you see all around you in Western civilization today. It's about doing this higher level of holy work. And so what do you see this holy work as? And have you any other sort of general comments just on this phase of man's will as we're speaking about? Yeah.
Well, only that it takes a lot of courage. Again, speaking in generalities here, it's going to be a courageous thing to do. And because there are so many impediments. And the family constellation, for instance, is key to this, because we embody these imagos of our parents, and many strange, crazy things that shouldn't happen, like our identification with them, especially when they're not heroic, and that then should teach people how difficult that is to break that. Other scholars like Owen Barfield have talked about us being in an age of idolatry, in which something very splendid in the past has got lost. It's very similar to what we were already talking about, except that Barfield said it's even in our period, even in the last 2,000 years, there's been even more devolution he acknowledged something in the ancient past. He certainly, but he said that, look, even since the birth of Christ, there's even been continuing devolution spiritually, and there's been the loss of what he called original participation in favor of where we are now in a kind of an age of idolatry. I have an article on that, on the michaeltsarion.com website called Age of Idolatry. Maybe you can link up to it. It's just, again, gives an overview of these points, because they're very, very deep, and one would have to go into a lot of different areas to get at this. But I think Crowley was aware of these things. He was aware of these other scholars, and he had read widely. And even though he was very antinomian, he also had a great deal of respect for certain thinkers. He had a special respect for J. Krishnamurti. Yeah, and others as well. He was very respectful of the sculptor Rodin, Auguste Rodin, whose secretary was the great poet Rainer Maria Rilke. So, there's more to Crowley than people realize. He was exposed to a lot of interesting continental thought. He studied in India, but he also had studied in Germany and in the continent, because the OTO, and by the way, I'm not a member of the OTO or any group like that, the OTO was started in Germany, you see. So he knew German thinkers, German occultists. He was widely traveled and widely read on many different subjects. He had climbed mountains in Switzerland. He was a first class, a top expert. In fact, at the time, the most expert mountain climber said, "Oh, no, the real genius is not me. It's this guy, Aleister Crowley." Okay, so the top mountain climber of his time actually gave the credit to Crowley as being the greatest mountain climber of his time. He was a master sword fencer, and also he was a master poet. He was a very, very good poet. They call him minor, right, in comparison to the real, top people like Shelley and Swinburne and Byron and people like that. But he could hold his own. He was not an inferior poet, really. And it's only because you have the other greats like Rossetti and people like that, the John Keats, that Crowley was sort of passed over. But he was quite a poet, and he wrote several books on poetry. So he was, never forget that this man was very scholared in his own way and has to be taken quite seriously, even though he did have in his own life a sort of a libertine streak, which would have made him fit in well with celebs of today who, are headline grabbers and they play to the crowd. There was definitely that aspect in him as well. So, because people who know his astrology chart know that the planet Uranus was quite prominent in this regard. So he was a bit of a cad, a bit of Jack the Lad type person who loved the publicity. So, but never to completely focus on that completely, I think would be a good way to look at it.
Yeah. And when you wrote there about, the spirit of freedom coming through of this age of Horus, you'd said about, when you get greater freedom, this does not mean becoming more debauched and more immoral. On the contrary, it requires greater discipline and order. Why do you think greater discipline and order is needed when somebody has more freedom? What are these sort of two different things that pull people in the different directions towards this immorality that we see around us? And what sort of motivates this other sort of will?
Because he's talking here about the will to resist that which is imposed upon you. He simply knew, instead of thinking in highfalutin terms, think simply.
Yes.
He knew that the moment that a kid, a child, an adult tries to be free, this is when the crabs are going to try and pull you back into the bucket. And this is just on a mundane level. This is not when you're trying to do anything out of the ordinary. But when you are trying to go even a little bit further, because, he talked also about a thing called the magical will. Maybe we can talk about that later on as well. That's quite something different, But just on the most mundane level, the person who tries to be free is going to be labeled a libertine. Think of a teenager who tries to go his own way and find out who he is, and maybe say, I'm not going to go to school like you want me, and I'm not going to be that lawyer or that doctor. I want to explore other things. That person is going to be immediately lambasted and pilloried. And one of the things that they'll be called is a libertine. You just want to go your own way and have fun. But that may be true for some people, but it may not be true for a lot of other people. They go, no, I want to be free. That doesn't mean that I'm an undisciplined so-and-so, that I'm just going to continue going through my life, as a libertine, trying this and trying that. But society might cast you in that role, you see. And this is, again, what people are dealing with. So this is not some highfalutin thing. This is something that he knew as a sociologist, as a psychologist. It's something, that I think that Osho also was aware of, the spiritual guru Osho, in the best periods of his life. He was very conscious of this. So when he went to America, he was an advocate, or at least he was blamed of being an advocate of free love. This is how he got headlines. This is how, they came down on him. But what he was really doing was something more akin to, say, Wilhelm Reich. Right? He was talking about the Puritanism and the lockdown sexual mores that he claimed were preventing his disciples and his students from progressing. Now, you and I may, disagree with this. I'm not telling you that I agree or disagree with any of this. I'm just explaining it as it was. So he said, all you are there sitting in front of me in these yoga poses, and you have arrived here, so you must be looking for truth. Most of you are teenagers. But you're so sexually fucked up, like armored. And you've been so browbeaten by this Puritanism of America that you haven't really even explored your own bodies. You haven't explored, you're all locked down in terms of your erogenous zones and what have you. It's very, very akin to what Wilhelm Reich was talking about. And immediately, what happened? The whole of American society came down on his head, exactly as they had done on Wilhelm Reich's head. Wilhelm Reich's books were the first to ever be burned in America. Think of that. The free country, right? Wasn't free for him. And he was finally locked up for 2 years in a institution. He basically died there. And all he was talking about was repression. Classic Freudian repression, except, framed in his own way. But he wasn't wrong. The American mind is repressed sexually and in other ways. But dare you poke at it? Dare you draw attention to it? Now, here's the weird thing to answer your question. It is exactly that kind of repressed person who becomes debauched, not the teacher who tells you to deal with it in a healthy way, to become aware of it. He's not advocating, now you can go and fuck your brains out. Neither of these men were talking about that. He was saying that if you don't correctly deal with your sexuality, which is your libido, and with your repressions, some other force within you, will darken and become pathological, and it's out of that you get your rapists and your misogynists and whatever else. Oh, and also your true libertines, who now have to break free in a violent way, and then go and violate the rights of others, like in these S&M things and what have you, right? Crowley and all did not approve of any of that. He was coming from the old tantric model, which links sexuality to something very, very spiritual. Now, we can argue about that, and say, oh, okay, I don't agree with that particular philosophy. But I'm just explaining what they thought. So they thought that the person in the West who does not have a healthy sexuality, and of course that means on the broader scale, a healthy relationship with their own body, with their own soma, They're in dire straits. On one level, because they're repressed, they'll have these black robes, right? Guilt trip you to death and have you under their thumb like a bug, making you feel eternally guilty about your natural needs, sexual and other, right? Which of course is what's happening all over the world and even in the East. You'll have this false asceticism, which poses as mysticism and is not. Or you get the unleashing of the debauchee. So both these things are bad for the psyche, poisonous, that will destroy you. Right? Being riddled in guilt and wanting to belong to a religion that's riddled in guilt, or being this licentious hippie, like at Burning Man now, it's all just sexually debauched over there, right? He knew that this would come, because what can you do? There's only two ways. And that kind of freedom is what you're talking about. The lunatic who thinks he's free just because he's a playboy, just because he messes around. That's not freedom, says Crowley. So it's a long way to explain what you're talking about. There's a certain discipline, there's a certain alignment with the universal will. So he's Nietzsche-like, but not Schopenhauerian. Schopenhauer believed the will is ultimately an evil thing, and if it does any good, that's usually an accident. Crowley didn't believe that. Crowley was more like the Nietzschean who said, say yes to life, say yes to the will. It won't lead you wrong. It only leads you wrong when you don't know how to ride that stallion correctly. And most people do not know how to ride it correctly. So it's like the two extremes, the ascetic on one side and the libertine on the other. His words are about trying not to be either of those. You may have to experiment with either of those, though, right? Like Osho was telling his students, you may have to experiment to find out what I'm saying. You must maybe have to go wrong to get back to being right. And so what he's thinking of, and I think Crowley was the same, is that maybe the world does have to go mad sexually. Maybe nice words and explanations aren't going to work. The repressions are so utterly deep that we're going to have the gay way, and we're going to have the transgender, and we're going to have the utter debauchery. Look at women's fashions. Is there a debauched fashion? Every single body part has to be shown with their see-through dresses and their cracks showing and the rest of it, right? And the nipples and the bras come with fake nipples now, and the whole shebang. I don't even have to go into it and explain. Yeah, this is what woman signs on for, right? So Crowley is saying, hey, I don't advocate it, but maybe in this movement of a deeper spirit from beneath, there's going to be this upheaval. And maybe man does have to swing over, to absolute debauchery in order to find out the hard way. No, this is not right. But it's very wrong for us to then say he's the poster boy for any kind of libertinism, like, say, the Marquis de Sade or something like that. No, he's not. And that's why in my work, I did not, like some people do, they identify him with a kind of Marquis de Sade type. I did not do that in the article, and there's a reason for not doing that. I think that's going too far.
Yeah, as you mentioned, the spectrum of the individual might have to go through being exploring the aesthetic side of themselves, exploring this libertine. It seems to perfectly overlay of what's going on the collective level. We have this old occult adage of as above, so below, as within, so without. And so maybe these kind of things go through the journey of an individual, and it's exactly what's happening in the West now, is it's going through that journey of swinging too far one way of all this sort of madness you've described. And we're going to go back towards some sort of, hopefully, a middle ground, some of these sort of, it's the middle way really, isn't it?
That's right. This is what often happens. Yeah. The pendulum does have to swing to extremes, yes.
And it sort of brings us on to the next slide here. We were speaking about what's the cause of all of these sort of issues, and one of them is repression, as you've mentioned a few times. And when we speak about repression, one of the people we should speak about for how to overcome it is the great psychologist Nathaniel Branden. And again, this is a quote from your article. When a person represses certain thoughts, feelings, or memories, he does so because he regards them as threatening to him in some way. When specifically a person represses certain emotions or desires, he does so because he regards them as wrong, as unworthy of him, or inappropriate or immoral, or unrealistic, or indicative of some irrationality on his part, and as dangerous because of the actions to which they might impel him. And this comes from Nathaniel's book, The Psychology of Self-Esteem. And so, have you any thoughts on that, Michael? Any thoughts on Nathaniel Branden and about this repression, and why do certain emotions get labelled as immoral? Sort of how does that play into modern sort of society and how it lays it up?
Well, this, of course, would have interested Crowley enormously. He may not have used exactly the same words as a typical psychologist, but his mind was very much on what you're talking about, and that's why I added this modern psychologist into the article. You see, anything that you could possibly repress in your own psyche is always done at the behest of the crowd, which is society, starting with the parents. You don't repress. Man is a non-repressed being until he encounters other people. Right? So the shadow, what Jung called the shadow, is really more, it's better to understand it as a kind of a realm, a shadow realm, a dumping ground. So you have to mix Freud and Jung together, half and half. Half of them got it wrong and half of them got it right. But Jung got it more right. But even still, when he talks about shadow, it sounds like it's a single archetype. And it is, but that can also be difficult for us to really understand. I think it's better to understand the shadow archetype as a sort of a shadow realm, a dumping ground. But what gets dumped there and why? Right? The process is absolutely orchestrated entirely by what we call the superego, which is a part of us, part of the ego structure that faces society and scans society, the one that we happen to be in, and registers any kind of mores, standards, and expectations of those around us. And it's because of that, you see, that this editing, censoring, and pruning takes place. And the sum result of it is, it starts working around 7 years old, in a big way, and continues all the way through life. And what it is trying to do is adjust us to an abnormal world. And Aleister Crowley was just one more man, great in his greatness, who understood this. But of course, it's happening unconsciously. That's why it's the subject of psychology. It's unconscious. You're not aware that this is happening. You're not aware that you are a victim of internal psychic apartheid, and that there's only one person who can ever change it, and that's yourself. So Do What Thou Wilt is a call, not of the Schopenhauerian will, which he believed, Schopenhauer believed was dark and ultimately evil, and Schopenhauer had a very pessimistic view. No. Crowley is coming from the Nietzschean school, you see, which musters will, which musters courage, which musters action, and tries to get you out of this mess. Because obviously, society is not going to help you do this. Society is the problem. Now, even that is only to half state the problem, that because of the crowd we repress. The crowd is imported into our heads. I have a podcast on Enslaved called The Crowd in Your Head.
Yeah, that's great.
So this is not something that when you get bored of it, oh, well, I just need to step aside from it. That fashion's over. What the hell? I move on. No, not so simple. Not so simple. You're not just a member of the physical crowd. This crowd is the will of the crowd is interjected into your mind and starts to overwrite your personal will. And Aleister Crowley was one of these men who was very, very up on this. And he knew that in most people, their personal will to power, or their will to meaning, whichever you want, has been thwarted, practically non-existent. Right? You become entrained like a zombie into the will of the crowd, one way or another. But you're unconscious of this. You're not aware that you're doing it. So what Crowley and people like him were intent upon changing is this scenario. Man must become aware of the strings that, like, that guide him like a puppet. He's got to doubt that he operates with his own will. And for Crowley, magic is entirely that. The occult is entirely that. Now, I'm not saying for others it's that, other occultists, but for him it was. The strengthening of what he called the magical will, in which you're able then to spar with the collective will, get to know it real well, and say, oh no, you're not pushing me around. There's a card number 8 in the tarot called Strength, you see, which fascinated Crowley. And it sort of has as a sub-theme of that card, this thing we're talking about. There's other cards that represent it as well, but that one particularly has this dynamic. How do you muster your own will, strengthen it to the point where you can fight the world, fight the system? And then, of course, if you are oriented that way, what might happen? Is the will of the crowd stronger than you? So if somebody gives you this message of fighting the crowd, are they telling you to go commit suicide? Are they damning you to a life of frightful pain and suffering? They might be. Nietzsche was of the opinion that you will suffer. But then, says Crowley, says Nietzsche, says people like that, it is exactly that suffering that's going to be the spiritual octane to take you to God. And no other. This is the path of the magician. It is a path like the path of the mystic, of suffering. And you won't really even know what that type of suffering is until you've done what I've just said. The real suffering he's talking about isn't just some, day-by-day pain or suffering or physical ill health, or the neurotic suffering, which is, I wish I could be part of the crowd, but they just don't want me.
Yeah.
Woe is me. I'm a depressive. I've knocked and knocked, but they just won't let me in. They don't like my pimples, or I'm not smart enough, or, I'm not macho. I don't know what it is. But I'd love to. I'll do anything to belong. This is the suffering that most people think is suffering all over the world. I don't fit in, but I want to fit in. Crowley's not talking about that. He's talking about the suffering of the outsider, the suffering of the man on the Siddhartha road. But at the same time, he's not telling you to not participate in the world. He's not telling you to be an ascetic. People have turned over 2 pages at once. They go, oh, I get it. Sure, I'll just abjure sexuality then. I won't be bothered getting married and having kids. I see what you're saying there, so I'm going to stay away from society. This is the classic faux pas, the terrible mistake. Crowley never said that. He said you can do that if you want. If you want to study some yoga, go ahead. But never, never, never was his message. He was married himself and had a child. Okay? He had mistresses all over the fucking place, right? So, no. This whole thing is attitudinal. Live a full and complete life. But within your attitude, you see, there has to be a fundamental change. And not to shy away from the kind of suffering, which everybody's doing. In fact, the more that you get into the crowd, like these social justice warriors today and the thugocracy, these so-called activists and progressives, these wokies, no. The more you embody yourself in the crowd, the more you're trying to avoid legitimate suffering. And you'll spiral down into, pathology instead of up towards spiritual heights. Because it is this kind of suffering that we've just been describing that is the real octane. You see, that without which you can make no legitimate spiritual progress. And this has to be understood.
And so in a way, it's almost like an existential kind of suffering, more so than this sort of pain or these sort of physical things people speak about. And
Good point.
it brings us
Good
on.
point.
Yeah.
Very
it brings
much
us perfectly onto, the existential view of it all. So yeah, I was going to say it brings us on to the next slide there perfectly, which is this Siddhartha road we were speaking about. And once again, this is a quote from your article here, Michael. The trouble comes from society, which often shapes one's personality in aberrant ways. The unrepressed, willful individual doesn't allow this to continue. He avoids being negatively influenced and won't follow society's lead. He is, therefore, bound to be cast as a rebel by his fellows and his society. Nevertheless, his existence is not overcast by the inner shame and anxiety that plagues those who contravene natural and human law to get ahead in the malignant society made in their image. The spiritual man's goals are not achieved by way of other humans. Others are not used and abused on the Siddhartha road. What others think, say, and do doesn't have a lot of impact for a man on the mystical path. The mystic isn't interested in being accompanied on his journey by sickly repressed types living their lives in denial, denial of denial, and perpetual anxiety, relying on sordid and ultimately brief, unsatisfactory escapes from it. And so this seems to be exactly the theme of what we're speaking about. Do you see this law, this spiritual law that sort of guides a man, is that he does not impact upon other people? Is that sort of the main issue that's going on that Crowley speaks about as well?
It's not his motive. You can't act in this world without influencing other people, and some people can think that all influence is wrong. It may be, but we need it. We're in such a desperate state that you need to look up to mentors and you need the guidance of smarter people who've worked things out. And even we are going to at some point influence other people. So I don't see I think it's a moot point to be talking about whether influence is good or bad. It's something built into the world. It's ontological, right? But you must not make it your motive. Right? Now, again, this will be misinterpreted by people saying, oh, you mean to tell me that you can influence people and feel no guilt about it? You see, they'll think that you're not only a rebel, but a debauchee, somebody who moves through life, creating influences and then having no accountability. You see how quickly this can become misinterpreted. And that's why we have so few mystics. Because when you hear that voice telling you, don't be selfish, take accountability, we go, oh yeah, okay, and we run back into the crowd. We are the ones who step off the Siddhartha road when we hear these voices, and we don't want to be left out, and we don't want to be badgered, and we don't want to be hectored. Because there's a very strange, we've talked about this on several podcasts on Unslaved, by the name of Sage versus Psychopath. And this was all to explore just this one simple theme about how sometimes very close the two roads come together. The line that divides a sage from a psychopath can be so hard to determine, so hard to see, that they almost bleed into each other. And this is what you're talking about here would illustrate that. Because if a man decides to go his own way, regardless of what anybody else says, and no matter how much condemnation is piled on his head, and how guilty he's told to feel, this can be even with a teenager again. Is he going to say, right, that's it, I can't take the pressure, so I'm going to conform and go back to where I was and make these people happy? Or is the will within him going to say, fuck you, I won't do what you tell me? And this is the sheep from the goats moment, and it will come into everybody's life. And this is the time when, of course, most people do not commit because there's no signposts. As soon as you step onto the Siddhartha road, you find out that the laws of life by which you've been living fade away. There are no directives, there's no signposts, there's nothing. There's only your own will to proceed in basically a wilderness situation. The famous dark night of the soul. Now, there are signposts, but they're invisible to you in the early stages. There is a call, there is guidance. But in the beginning, you may not, perceive it because there's this long sort of withdrawal process from the world and its lies. And so that's why in my work, I'm always advising people to go read your Nathaniel Brandons, your Ayn Rands, and other names that I mention, so that when you make this transition, it's going to be a lot easier. because I know that it is easier when you have certain guidance from some very special people who've written, and then you're not completely shaken, and therefore you're more likely to stay the course now of the Siddhartha road rather than jump back for the comforts of the world and to be accepted. Yeah. And remember, as we said, you already have a disposition within you that wants you to conform, that anchors you to the norms by default. So it's very, very difficult to break that patterning and conditioning. And it is a kind of suffering that will force you to do it. But look what our world has to do with suffering. We're a pleasure-soaked society. So this, what I'm calling legitimate suffering, not neurotic misery. That's a whole other subject, a whole other discussion. Legitimate suffering. And without it, no spiritual progress can be made. None at all. So what Big Pharma is doing, what the world is doing, is telling you a fiction, a fallacy. Hey, take this pill or do such and such to get rid of your neurotic misery. And you go, great, I want that. Yeah, I'll go for that. But you didn't read the small print. The very thing that you're taking to get rid of neurotic misery also obliterates the legitimate suffering within you. That's the plan of the real beast.
Yeah, yeah.
And this is, of
It's
course,
so deep.
then probably one of the greatest dangers that the human race faces.
Mm. And with the advent of things like the internet, which made communication, the cost of communication zero, the voice of the crowd or the influence of crowd has almost seemed like it's gotten a lot stronger onto people. And so their avoidance of this legitimate suffering got stronger and stronger, of needing to be, a stronger individual, more atomized in today's society. And so I was wondering if you thought more about what is it about this type of suffering that makes it different? Is it the turning away from the crowd? Um, is the suffering coming from the breakdown of this sort of persona that you build up over time? Is it the breakdown of that causes your suffering? And do you see there being an age when someone's life where they are more likely to come into this when a man grows into it, this dark night of the soul? Is this something in the 40s that happens, or does it come much sooner, or is it just dependent on the individual?
Well, it depends on the individual. Yeah.
Mm.
Yeah. This can
Mm-hmm.
hit people very young, actually, as well as old. It cuts across all of that. And it can also happen when there's a certain loss in your life, a shakeup, loss of a job, loss of a loved one, bad health, um, or as the existentialists say, you're overcome with the feeling of nothingness, of how the brevity of life, and that when your life is over, there's an eternity of nothing and you'll never be again. When people contemplate that, very few people actually do, because we've got our taboos about that, right? But if somebody dies in your life and you bring death into your life in this conscious way, it becomes very difficult to see what life's purpose is, So rather than fleeing away from that into ontic existence, which is just, everydayness, you face it squarely. And you say an eternity where I will never be again, this is my life. There's a certain transformation that takes place, a certain grasping in a much more vivid way of what we call existence, what we call being. So that's it. But of course, there's also the myriad ways of avoiding that, what we've just talked about. Death is just something that happens to other people, so to speak, and we don't grasp it. We don't become more authentic. And so we just remain one of the crowd, one of the herd until our dying day. And then even our death isn't really ours. It's just an obituary. Somebody died. I wasn't there when I died. I died, but it was me who died, but I wasn't really there. I'm not present. See, death is something in the now. Death is something that you have to be conscious of in every single breath, every single moment of your existence. And the realization that there's a precipice awaiting you. And after that's over, that's it. There's just eternal, for eternity, you as who you are will never be again. Isn't that going to affect you in some way? Well, the whole human race is walking around And it doesn't affect them one bit. They're tied up in their roles, they're tied up in their duties, they're tied up in all this performance, and there's nothing to untie it. But as the existentialist warned, no, this, grasping of the uniqueness of yourself, of your being, the brevity of your existence will shock you into a change, hopefully. And that's the theory. Now, when we look around the world, we actually find out that might be a very big weakness in existential theory because it's not really happening. And that's a separate argument we can get into. But the theory of the existentialist was, the more you think about your death in a positive way, the more that your life will become more vivid in how you live it in the moment. That was the theory.
It reminds me of a quote from Alan Watts where he spoke about death as the great fertilizer of life, whenever you're thinking about it all the time, everything else just sort of falls away into irrelevance that it is. Yeah.
That's right.
And
That's right.
and
Yes. And it does. Of course, it will do. If to a person who's sincere, though.
Yes. Yeah. And so, I'll carry on with a couple more of these slides and just keep working on sort of the theme that we've been going through here. And so this was just a further one from your article once more, Michael. It was Crowley understood that the greatest violence that exists is committed by a man towards his own being. External manifestations of violence and injustice are merely symptoms of self-sadism. To end the cycle of dysfunction, the adept becomes hygienic emotionally, mentally, and morally. Although he may not conform to rules and regulations imposed by states, governments, or peers, he is not without ethics and conscience. The adept is not a dropout, malingerer, anarchist, or felon. On the contrary, he has the courage to make his own rules and live by them without the promise of rewards from an infantile society. He wants nothing from his fellows, neither their approval nor disapproval. He is, as Ayn Rand advised, a man free from men. And so, have you any comment just on this line here, Michael, about external manifestations of violence and injustice are merely symptoms of self-sadism? How does this tie into what we've just been speaking about?
Well, that would take far too long to actually get into, but see, the superego is created in order to try and lower anxiety, childhood, rage, and fears, and what have you. But there's always a leftover part that the superego cannot deal with. And so there's always going to be this free-floating anxiety, not as much as there would be without it. Well, because if you didn't have the censorship of the superego, you'd be a raving madman, right? You'd be a complete delinquent. But because the superego is so clever at adjusting you to society, it sort of does, it's a coping mechanism. It's the master of all coping mechanisms. And so in most people, not all, but in most people, it does a fairly good job. But there'll always be this surplus. It can never completely mollify and dissolve all of the anxiety. So there's this leftover part. But that's not going to be good for you because obviously, as you turn to face the world and its challenges, this is a source of endless more anxiety. The day-by-day existence. Think of what a teenager has to go through. So rather than going into the world anxiety-free, you already have this infantile primary forms of anxiety that the superego just cannot rein in, cannot completely bleach. So you go into the world, and of course it's different for different people. Some have a lot of this anxiety, some others, it's much less. And then you have all of this barrage of worldly anxiety, like meeting a girlfriend, and all the sexual stuff of the teenage years, and then a career, and then this and that and the other, and all the rest of the pressures. So this is why man is anxiety-ridden. And it is usually out of this intolerable condition that a great deal of then the delinquency and the violence happens. So that's the shortest, answer to that. You're already moving into a world that is deluging you with anxiety. So naturally, what are you going to do? You're going to push back, right? The will turn necrophilous, will push back. Because that's the job of the will. The job of the will is to push back. But the malignant will now pushes back in a violent, aggressive way. So you get your sadism. You even get your masochism. You also get the other side of the coin, but we've talked about that in other programs. The basic sadistic mentality, the aggressive, destructive, authoritarian type, is a discontent who doesn't really want to be in the world facing all these anxieties and has defaulted into just pure raw aggression, as his coping mechanism of dealing with it. So then you have to see a psychologist or whatever, to sort of reorient your superego and hopefully start dealing with the sources of anxiety and hypertension and all of that. It becomes a professional thing. But that would be, in a nutshell, one of the reasons. You're just flooded. You're flooded with anxiety, and you want to push back at the world violently, to try and cope with it.
Yeah, yeah. And it sort of takes us on to what the right path is. And a phrase that I quite like is this psychic sanitation. And so just to read a couple more little parts of the article here regarding this topic of psychic sanitation. In the magical tradition, Horus is the magus presiding over the process of psychic sanitization, as you say. He presides over the marriage of heaven and hell, the nucleation of psychic and physical energy. He is what the adept becomes when his personal will is attuned to the cosmic will, animus or logos. And this is a quote now from Aleister Crowley. Every man and woman is a star. That is to say, every human being is intrinsically an independent individual with his own proper character and proper motion. Do what thou wilt is the apotheosis of freedom, but is also the strictest possible bond. And so, do you see this process of wholeness really coming about by this marriage of heaven and hell? Has this got to do with a unification of the opposites? Is it about understanding the division within one's own nature? Or how do you see this process of psychic sanitization coming about?
Yeah, remember we said that once you've cracked some of the things we're talking about, you will know as a law that you cannot look to anybody else to help you. The crowd in your head, no, it's not going to work. You have to take up the mantle of change. It's totally personalistic. That's what it's about. Do what thou wilt is nothing but a call to the person. I've written a whole book on that called Disciples of the Mysterium, where we sort of go into that. What is personalism and how does it affect the mystical path, the philosopher, the ordinary man on the street? And I think I don't think of myself as a mystic. I think of myself as a personalist. It all connects. So this is this sense of responsibility. That's what Crowley's talking about there. The strictest possible bond is to your own self. Once you realize you're alone. Now, it doesn't mean that you will not cherish the works of other people who've already gone through what you're doing. Of course you will. Of course you will. Right? And they do exist. But the real yoga, see, yoga means to reunite.
Union, yeah.
Yeah. And it means with yourself, with your conscience, with your higher self. So that's what it means. And then when you come into communion with that spirit, of course it's the strictest possible bond between you and that spirit. And it will not be the same as your bonds, domestically and socially.
Yeah. And just a little bit more about do what thou wilt then. Unlike the adept, the morally inferior man waits for the stimuli of the world to turn him on. He is simply incapable of bringing meaning from within himself. He neither commands nor obeys his true will. And this is a quote from Michael Tsarion. Whoever cannot find a temple in his heart, the same can never find his heart in any temple. The motto, do what thou wilt, implies attunement between the microprosopus and the macroprosopus, or in plain language, the ego and the imperial self, which cannot be achieved until the pseudo-self undergoes deconstruction. This deconstruction cannot occur until man separates himself from collective factors responsible for creating and perpetuating the pseudo-self. This separation cannot occur until man has developed sufficient psychic strength or will to break free and devise his own path. One he must walk alone. And so then we spoke about this imperial self and then this law. Aloneness is usually wanting until a man's character is deepened by suffering, which is less likely in a conformist society that suppresses legitimate expressions of emotion and dissuades individuals from addressing the darker sides of life. Therefore, instead of attunement with the imperial self, we have immersion in the collective. As Crowley knew, the so-called I is not necessarily identical with the imperial self. The self, or I, of a spiritually inferior man is merely a pastiche of everyone's attitudes and beliefs, the product of a pathogenic society. To such a creature, the ideas of independence, aloneness, and psychic sovereignty are contemplated with dread, and men who embody these states are despised and ridiculed on sight. And then this is a quote from Crowley, and it harkens back to what we were speaking about earlier. Whatever your sexual predilections may be, you are free, by the law of Thelema, to be the star you are, to go your own way rejoicing. It is not indicated here in this text, though it is elsewhere implied, that only one symptom warns that you have mistaken your true will, and that is, if you should imagine that in pursuing your way, you interfere with that of another star. It may, therefore, be considered improper, as a general rule, for your sexual gratification to destroy, deform, or displease any other star. Mutual consent to the act is the condition thereof. Have you any
Absolutely
comments
right.
on that, Michael? Yeah, it was
Well, we
bang
already
on, isn't
covered
it?
that
Yeah.
earlier, where he's not a libertine.
Mm-hmm.
You see, he's
Mm-hmm.
saying it has to be consensual. He's not a sadomasochist. He's not somebody who's going to tell you to just run amok. You know, it's quite clear in his own writings. So the diatribes against him from people who haven't bothered reading any of his work, you see, this is scandalous. And of course, we have this. He kind of liked the scandal. So, you know, we have to factor that in as well. But ultimately speaking, those who read his works know that he's nothing really like the way he's been portrayed in the gutter press, you know, and the internet and what have you, all these trolls and Christian idiots. They have no idea what he was talking about whatsoever. You can just, pretty much dismiss anything they have to say.
Yeah, no, I know what you mean. And one of the big things he spoke about there is this difference between the self, what that you spoke about was the self and the imperial self. Could you give people a little bit of an overview then, once more, of what this self is, maybe the ego, and then what is this imperial self that you speak of as well?
Well, this is in Jungian terms, you see, the self is the ego, but it's something that the ego is going to blossom into. And so, unlike in Eastern traditions where you're meant to sort of negate and annihilate selfhood, egohood, this is not the Western tradition at all. There will be many death experiences that the ego has to go through. We just mentioned the dark night of the soul. But those death experiences are only there as a prelude to a greater blossoming of selfhood. Until finally there is the blossoming into, what I call the imperial self. You see? So this does not speak of any kind of annihilation of selfhood, which is common in the Eastern traditions, That's what that means, really. It's the ultimate goal of rites of passage. If somebody says there's these things called rites of passage, how can that have any... What does a passage mean unless it's leading somewhere? So people will acknowledge there's rites of passage and the hero's journey, but where does it end? Right? It has to end in a blossoming of something. Now, if you look at card number 0, the Fool card that opens the tarot, on the dress of the Fool, you see these blossoms, these flowers. Right? The whole thing is a symbol of a blossoming. At the end of the road into a much more omnipotent understanding in terms of your psyche, really. We start off as the ego, which is kind of the microcosm, like the macroprosopus, as you rightly read, and then this thing, blossoms into something else. But what it blossoms into is never prescribed by any other path or person or tradition. It's going to be a 100% unique phenomena.
Yeah, yeah. And it sort of just takes us on to the next little slide here. We speak about adjustment, which is another card of the tarot. This is the photo of it. Justice or adjustment is the 8th or 11th card of the major arcana. It represents the magical will, or in simple terms, the cultivation of the ability to embody the opposing view to one's own favored beliefs, opinions, and arguments. It represents the Imperial of pre-Socratic philosopher Anaximander, as well as the Taoist sage who fulfills his will without action and utters his word without speech. The adept who attunes with the magical will, higher self, becomes the hegemon of the Athenian philosophers. He becomes the supremely happy man. He is his own servant and master, needing no gods or religions, panaceas or bromides, rewards or salvation. He has lived fully and completely in the now and has not restricted or repressed his vital energy by excessive masochism, altruism, and guilt. You mentioned this earlier about this magical will, then, Michael. Um, is this mainly just listening then to this voice of the imperial self that's coming through, that's calling the ego forward? This is listening to the voice of the conscience instead of the voice of the crowd? Or is there a difference or nuance that I'm missing there?
No, you got it right. It's the move from habituation to individuation. The habituation is, again, obeying the crowd, obeying your peers, going along with whatever standards are in society, and you sign on for it. There is really no gun to your head. It is something that you willfully do, and therefore your will, when correctly educated, when you understand that by doing that, by doing the will of the superego, you are actually committing a crime against your higher self, against the imperial self, then you'll stop doing it. And this is the point where, you awaken the magical will, which stands in resistance to this. Now, when you break it down as that statements did, there's another level to it, which is that rather than you having to be criticized by other people in regards to what you believe, the magical will is one who already knows what the opposing position is as lucidly as the thing that you hold sacred. So it doesn't mean that you lose the thing that you believe in and hold to be true. But no one else needs to tell you what the opposite position is. You are so up to speed in it. Now, for Aleister Crowley, this was absolutely paramount. And he taught this. And this card adjustment, embodies this, encapsulates this particular law. And so you are a walking dialectic in the Socratic or even Aristotelian way. You are a walking dialectic. Always the very opposite position of the position that you hold is clear to you. And it goes back and forth. So this is how to escape dogma, right? To escape the dogmatic posture. You change your comportment in this way. No one can tell you. So this is a highly educated man, right? A highly educated person. He doesn't rely on anyone else coming and going, but I can contradict that, mate. What you just said there's full of holes. I can contradict it. No. You yourself have studied the counterpoint of everything that you believe. It's really a task. And that's why he talks a lot about the will, because it's going to take willpower to do that.
Yeah. It is in essence what really is going on. So we have the journey of the individual over their life of what it's meant to be. So you have the ego, you have this pseudo self that forms under the direction of the superego. You're trying to break that down on this path of individuation by moving away from the crowd. And that's to become more in line with the vision of the imperial self. Is essentially what the architects of control doing is they just understand that extraordinarily well, and they just use the modern methods of psychology and of behavioral economics, behavioral science, just to manipulate that path, just to throw it off, just to keep us enslaved. Is that in essence what the fuck the conspiracy is? Yeah.
Oh, I've been mentioning that since the beginning of my work in this field. It's the only thing that interested me to get across.
Yeah.
That's exactly right.
Mm.
Yeah, they're masters of it. See, they've learned these teachings, these truths from the psychological, masters. And they couldn't believe what had fallen into their hands. We talked about the surfeit of anxiety. We talked about the buried rage. We talked about the identification with the object of your hate. Do you realize what a big one that is? Which then causes a self-loathing because you hate yourself for that very thing, for that very identification. And boy, do they use that one. So I spent a lifetime trying to point out to people the weapons that they're using and how they're using it, in this exact way. Yeah. And also mentioned the redeemers, people who can lead you out of this mess, which is would be wanting. It's no good just pointing at the problem. You've got to point out, people who have solutions to these problems. Otherwise, you're not being fair with the people that you're talking to. You're sort of leaving them in the lurch.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I'll maybe take us just onto our last slide. There's just the final few quotes from the article I thought it'd be a good idea just to pop through as well, as they stood out to me a little bit. The final quotes here. The true will must be consciously grasped by the mind, and this work is akin to that called the attainment of the knowledge and conversation of the holy guardian angel. In the knowledge and conversation of his holy guardian angel, the adept is possessed of all he can possibly need. To consult any other is to insult one's angel. The single supreme ritual is the attainment of the knowledge and conversation of the holy guardian angel. It is the raising of the complete mass in a vertical straight line. Any deviation from this line tends to become black magic. Any other operation is black magic. You have another quote here, just Michael. These previously were from Aleister Crowley himself, but this last one is yours. Another of Crowley's antinomian phrases was love under will. This motto has also caused consternation among the orthodox who believe it exalts bestial proclivities. However, they forget that whatever stands beneath a thing holds it up. Crowley's love is not a subservient quality. Rather, it undergirds and supports an adept's will. To be attuned to one's will first entails the development of self-love. Have you any comments on that first off, Michael? And then we'll take it from there.
Yes. See, love under will is probably his most important motto. Far more important than do what thou wilt, which he didn't invent. He got that from a previous thinker, his master, Rabelais. But love under will is the key motto for Aleister Crowley. And I would say that any of his followers, this would be very, very important to them if they were serious. You see, at the end of the day, what is will? It's action. Right? Will is just a synonym for action. Now, the way that I think this needs to be explained simply to people is this. Man is a trinity. He's intellect, he's emotion, and he's willpower. But those things are out of alignment. Some people are more intellectually oriented, like your scientists, for instance. Others are more emotionally motivated, like your artists and poets and mystics. And others are just pure action for action's sake, like your average sportsman, your average everyday person who don't even question what they do. They just like the doing. And if ill health or something stopped them doing more, they wouldn't like it. They couldn't adjust. So you have this man as a trinity, and they're imbalanced. But love under will clearly shows me that Crowley himself was a mystic and not just a magician, as most people think he was. In fact, he was interested in magic. He was a practitioner of magic, and he knew a lot about it. But there's also this mystical orientation, this mystical undercurrent, this mystical trend. And this might sound like meaningless to people who have conflated mysticism with magic, which is a very, very, very common mistake that most people, and most of the listeners will make. They think they're just two words for the same thing, and they're definitely not. And people like Crowley knew that they're not. All magicians and occultists know that this is not totally to be conflated. So the mystical and poetic element in Crowley is revealed by this. The statement, love under will. As I say here, what you just read, anything that is beneath a thing sustains it, So love under will, love under action. It's perfect, right? He's talking about love. But when I said that man is a trinity, he's emotion, he's intellect, and he's will. Love is an emotion. So what is happening here? Crowley is telling you, just like the most modern neurologists now know, is that feeling and emotion are the essence of consciousness, not action and not thinking. conation, not cognition. You couldn't have cognation without conation, and conation is passion, emotion leading the way. And it's very important to get this precise. But back to our point about the difference between mysticism and magic. When will is aligned with intellect, you get magic. When will is aligned with emotion, you get mysticism. And when they're all aligned, as they rarely are, you get the magical will. You see how this works?
Yes. Yes.
So your scientist and that left brain type of person has united action or will with intellect, and off they go. And Crowley and the ones who know are saying, basically that is what your general magical occultist is up to as well. That still doesn't mean that there's not a spectrum. It's a lot, and remember the lines are also quite blurred because there's going to be there's going to be an oscillation between these states, so it's not fixed. I'm just giving you a general rule. So when emotion, when love, passion is united with the will, you're a mystic. And the fact that he made then this his motto is revealing the mystical quality in Aleister Crowley. It reminds me that if people ever want to read a couple of his own works, I can recommend. One is a book called Aha. These are very slim volumes, by the way. You can read them in a day. Aha. It's just called Aha. And it's a sort of a poem. It's a fascinating little poem that he wrote. Another book is Conks Om Pax, which is a story that's based on the Kabbalah. And I would also recommend probably the greatest book on the occult ever written, Book 4. This is about 100 pages. Book 4. If you want to read books about him that are recommended, I'd say Legend of Aleister Crowley, I think by Stevenson, is excellent. A book called Heart of the Master, which Crowley wrote himself, but it's more about him. There's a very interesting backgrounds in there that are very well worth reading. Heart of the Master. A book called Star in the West by Captain Fuller. And then, of course, as you mentioned on a previous program, you have Colin Wilson as well. So those would be very good books on Aleister Crowley about him that I can certainly recommend. Yeah. But this love under will is very, very important because it emphasizes that he was aware of the difference between the mystical path and the magical path. This, I think, is crucial. I've had to speak about it here in a very brief way, but I think it's valuable because some people fall into different categories. And remember, we started off these two programs asking, what is the occult? What is magic? Is it a return to the bicameral? Is it some way for us to connect with the moral universe? Or is it, something to do with the golden ages of the past, the golden epochs? But remember, the mystic has understood something fundamental. He says, you're never going to know God with the noggin. Cognition and knowledge and intellect will never penetrate what God is, because that's not what you're meant to be bothered with. You're meant to love God. It's all about love. That's your duty, bhakti. Don't presume to know God. Now the magician says, but God has the plan. We're living in God's plan. And so our magical formulas are a genuine way of learning what God's plan is for us. But the mystic responds and says, I'm not interested in God's plan. I'm interested in God's heart. I want to go to the heart of God, not continue being a part of his plan. You see, so they're not the same. And so this poetic mystical streak in Crowley is often never talked about properly. But I think it's there. And everyone, can read the little books I just mentioned there and brush up on it and see what they... And these are genuine books, not crap that you read on the internet. They're also not books written by scandalmongers who just want to make a name by putting Crowley, wheeling him out again and again for effect. But I would say there's a distinct difference. And it's not that one cannot dabble in one and then move to the other. Of course this is going to happen. I think that also the magician is somebody who, again, is saying, yeah, I want to know about God's plan, but that's veiled. And remember we talked earlier about purgation and purification, right? Both the mystic and the magician are going to agree that there's a purification, there's an opening of the doors of perception that is required on both sides. They may differ in how that's done. Some may be more ascetic. Others may say, no, I'm not going to go so far. There's lots of little nuances here and there on how this purification is going to take place.
Do you see that as the Negredo phase that the alchemists describe, which I guess in psychological terms is maybe this breakdown of the pseudo-self?
Yeah.
Is that what? Yeah, it's just another name.
It's exactly that. It has psychological ramifications, absolutely. And I would say, though, that there's a certain idiosyncrasy on both sides. When you're a magician, you can't join a fucking school. I know they had the Golden Dawn and, all this. It never works. And that's why you can't think of too many magical societies. So if you're going to be a magician, and I think book 4 that he wrote brings this out hugely. That's why he broke away from these other organizations. It's all about yourself. There's no way that the magical arts can be done in conjunction with other people. This is nonsense, and this also would be black magic if it was tried. And the mystical path is also to be done on an individualistic level. You can't get into groups. There's some people argue, that mysticism and religion are very, very, very connected. I don't think so. The mystics of the past might have been members of religion because you fucking had to be. If you were St. John of the Cross or St. Teresa or Catherine of Siena or whoever, what choice do you have? If you went your own way, they'd have burned you at the stake. So it was better to be under the protection of a church or a monastery to do your work. But that's fucking something forced, that level. So I think it's laughable for people to say that you can't be a mystic without being part of an institution. There are people who write this, and I don't agree at all.
That's mad.
So in both cases, personalism and individualism is key. But never forget, he was an artist, he was a poet, and he was a mystic. And love under will, exemplifies that. Can be no doubt about it.
It's really amazing he wrote this almost before psychology came mainstream. I appreciate Freud was around near the same time of that with it, but I'm sure that would have took a long time to extrapolate through society. The fact he was getting these insights from the occult, the last place that the crowd would think you would get this from, it really speaks to that there is something there for people to study, and there is a way to get through all the woo-woo, and the way you've been laying it out here in these last 2 episodes, it's unbelievable, it's fantastic. And I guess, did you ever come across his other book? I think there's a book, it's not under his name, but it's written by, it's just called The Three Initiates. It was another occult book that came about. I think it speaks about maybe the 9 laws of the universe, this kind of thing. Are you familiar with that? Or I might even just look it up to see. Yeah. I'll bring it up in our next, I'll bring it up in a further chat because there's something quite interesting. It's about the occult there, but I'll not deviate too far off into it so far. But yeah, it seems all of this sort of work, a lot of people make the mistake of trying to know God, as you mentioned again, about maybe trying to grasp him with the left brain, trying to break it down and trying to have a knowledge of him. But it's about loving God. This is the essence of what you were saying. This is the essence of what Crowley tried to teach. It's not an intellectual exercise. It's about feeling.
Yeah, I think he knew that there was both types, and
Mm-hmm.
I think he had a certain legitimacy for both routes,
Mm-hmm.
the path of the arrow and the path of the serpent. The path of the arrow is the path of the mystic, and the path of the coiling serpent that is slower and goes through more stages is the path of the magician. And he knew that people are going to fall into one or the other category. There's certain people who have a skill with one. Now, you see, the magician is somebody who says, loving God is also to admire his creations and to get up close to everything that surrounds us in a ritualistic and ceremonial way. What is rock? What are the elements? What is water? What is mercury? What is quicksilver? Right? What are the minerals? What is the periodic table of elements? You see, so they're hands-on, deeply immersed in this world, and they want to know what it all is about, what animals are about, what the things in front of us that are tangible, what are the magical properties and principles, and when you mix things together, and when you separate, you see? So the tendency of the magician is to stay close to the things of the world and see how they're being used, and to use those things like herbs, and potions and essences and elements. And there's nothing wrong with that. That's a very healthy thing. They're saying God is in his creation. And there are many veils. You're not going to understand God right away. We agree? So in our understanding and in our intellect, there needs to be this purification, but there also needs to be this familiarity. Remember we talked about Owen Barfield and his original participation. That was a very concrete thing. And it involved incantations and wordplay, and poetry and all the rest of it, and communication with animals and learning from the natural world. So the magical is very much, in a healthy way, focused on this world, what things can be combined together, what things can be understood. And the mystic way, we could argue, as is presented by most people, is sort of more off-world, more world negating, if you will. Doesn't always have to be, but it's generally thought of in that way. Most books that are on mysticism tend to be abstractive and ascetic, where the world and the body and sex and animals, are just sort of negated as being sort of lesser important. And there's this more focus on the transcendent. So it's up to people to study it and decide for themselves, which one is valid. Or, hey, can you do both? Remember I said, the magical will is when all of those three things are aligned. Will is just action. Action can be motivated by intellect, as the scientist, or by emotion, as is the poet and the artist. And the mystic and the magician fit in there as well. And when all three are properly aligned in exactly the same way that even Aristotle mentioned, then there's something completely, unique about that. It's this equilibrium that we're talking about. Why not have them all? So, yeah. I mean, the people who built the bloody pyramids must have had those three things aligned, right?
Yeah.
Had to be.
Yeah.
Action, knowledge with the sacred geometry and the numerology, right? And again, as I said, the magician is fascinated with numbers and wordplay and gematria and dimensions and sacred geometry, and very importantly, musical rhythm and harmony. All that stuff with Pythagoras and what have you, and architecture, so that things we build are embodiments of God and the dimensions of the human body. What's wrong with that? That's all the province of the magician. And the mystic is sort of saying, well, I take all that for granted. This is my platform, but I'm going to try and ascend from here and, through love of God, be taken up in more of an ecstatic manner. to be transported above the mundanities, you know? Hey, neither you or me are going to sit in judgment of either of these. We're just pointing it out, just illustrating it for people. It's up to their own character and temperament, you see, to see which one they are interested in.
And there's different names for this will that has come up then, this higher will, this will of the self. I think mentioned earlier was the cosmic will. And another way, I guess, for people to think about this is you have the voice of the crowd, this will, the power, as we've described. But this cosmic will, this is the will of the universe. And you are a part of the universe, kind of like how Alan Watts describes how, the ocean waves, but the universe peoples is one of his favorite sayings. And so one of the ways for people to try to, I guess, get the strength to move away from the crowd is to try to understand that this higher will is literally the will of the universe that's emanating through you. And the purpose of your life is to bring that into being, I guess. And is what the black magic is what the architects of control. It's simply just to crush that. It's just to push that down and then be driven by their will that they direct through these different kinds of psychological manipulation techniques.
Well, they don't see you as a human, fully human at all. They see you as just a sort of evolved animal. This, I think, helps to understand it. They don't grace you with anything human. See, one of the criticisms of say we were to now come at it from the more Michael Tsarion perspective, I'm interested in these things, not as we've been talking about them, but as how they're both abused. I know that both the mystical path and the magical path have been hijacked by fucking charlatans. And my interest always has been since a child is to identify the charlatanism within both of these things. Who are the false magicians luring you that way? You know, with their wordplay, with whatever, their persona. And who are the false mystics? And that's where I'm coming from. So the world controllers, that's how I got into it, looking into the conspiracy movement, right? These are false musicians. These are false mystics. But they've employed their Gnostic scions to sit on the banks of the Ganges, to fill the temples, these fucking Buddhists, right? You know, or you wouldn't believe the garbage, right? And all over the East, they have a plan. We've done numerous programs on Unslaved about Gnosticism, which are just second to none, right? To unpack all this. But this worldwide Gnostic movement is basically a satanic movement. And they don't even think of you as a human being at all. They think of you just as some, sort of retarded animal. Yeah.
Yeah.
And who's got no fucking clue of their own divinity whatsoever. And so they have they know what makes a true mystic and a true magician, right? They understand that intellectually. But they've been able to put in their false teachers, especially in the New Age movement. The New Age movement is like a apotheosis of this working out, this technique, these Rhonda Byrnes. Now, what they're doing is trying to regress you into magical child thinking. It's even with these J.K. Rowlings, and there's a lot of people involved in this, right? So they're false black magicians, so to speak, because they have understood that there is a parallel between higher spiritual development and lower regressive states. Right? It's actually called Euroboric. Now, there's the winged Ouroboros of the dragon, which is the fifth element. See, a dragon, his claws represent the earth. Scales represent the fish, the water. The wings represent the air, and the fire that he breathes represents the fire. But bring them all together, and the dragon itself is the quintessence, or the fifth element. So that's the higher evolved emblem of the mystic. The Ouroboros eating its own tail, without those, traits, is just the circle of the archaic, regressive, chthonic world. And you can also say that that is the unconscious world of regression. But the strange thing is that these two realms have certain similar properties. And therefore, somebody who doesn't mean you well can sort of transfer and seduce you into thinking that the lower one is the equivalent of the upper one. So this is what Gnosticism is about when you unpack it. This is what non-dualism is about, this cult of non-dualism that's been spreading and maybe getting even more traction as I speak. Well, this non-dualistic, and there's other things as well. They actually to regress you, this ayahuasca cult, right, of running down to the Amazon. It's all based on what I'm talking about. I've got an article you can make a link up to called Happy Discontents. This whole Burning Man culture is part of it, right? But in a strange mirroring way, the one mirrors the other. And therefore, it's very easy by using sleight of hand to make people think that a regressive move back to magical child thinking is the equivalent of real spiritual development. Yeah.
It's the regression to the womb, isn't it? Is what this metaphor is we've spoke
Yeah.
about. This is what the Ouroboros is a symbol of. These, you're not evolving. You're only just going in a circle. Whereas you're speaking of the dragon is this integration of the different elements to create a new whole. Yeah.
That's
I
right.
see what you mean exactly.
And the East is rampant with the other one, you see, and that's why Eastern teachings have been polluting and poisoning Western thinkers for a long, long time. And anyway, the Eastern teachings are, for the most part, annihilation of the self. This is the one thing you've got to watch out for. And that's the indication, you see, that it's this regressive stuff. But they've got millions of ways of disguising that. Why it's so difficult is because they've had thousands of years to massage their teachings, and make it look real holy. It's not. But they've had a lot of time to window dress the thing. And the schmucks in the West, go for it. You can't stop them. Because there's something instinctual within them that feels that the ultimate way of reducing anxiety is to get rid of the self that's anxious. See, the true magician doesn't want any repression. But didn't we say that the coping mechanism of the superego has to repress their anxiety? If you don't have that repressing anxiety sensor, anxiety will flood into your being. But that's what the magician says is necessary for you to have. And we go, what? The unrepressed soul won't just have a little bit of free-floating anxiety that I spoke of, the little leftover part, which is already disabling enough. The magician is telling you to open the floodgates. Face the rage and the fear. Don't have the censor. And unleash from yourself all the anxiety that's within you. That's the purgation he's asking for. You think the human race is going to go for that after we've gone to the length of importing the whole fucking crowd into our head and strengthening the superego? Well, the magical path is saying you should have no repression whatsoever. Let it all out. But when you have a technique for doing that, like Wilhelm Reich formed, Alexander Lowen, Arthur Yanov, we don't want to know. We pillory those guys. Aleister Crowley, Osho, anyone who even tries to dabble in those things and suggest those things. We are so petrified by that rage. That's why the superego came in to repress it. It's so huge that we are scared of what will happen to us if it ever comes to the surface. So we just deny it and say, denial of denial. I can't let this through. So we rather remain toxic. We rather remain infirm. And the system, the boys that you're talking about, know this. But they also know that there is within all of that anxiety and that maelstrom of anxiety and self-loathing, there is still a will to meaning that cannot be suppressed. There's still in people an urge to go towards the divine. Like I said, we're beings who want to know. We're beings who want to have a meaning in our life. They know this. So they hijack that and say, well, we won't give them the real. Right? But we'll give them some false construction called Christianity. Right? The Aeon of Osiris. Or we give them some goddess worship. That's some new age shit. We got 100 ways. We give them some fucking ayahuasca. They'll love that. Just pour it down their fucking throat. Some snake piss. They'll fucking go for that. I know. Give them some turban heads. All high on fucking mushrooms over there in the east. But the schmucks will go for it. These wallies. Over here. No problem. What the fuck? We do. If it's got a long beard, that's it. So the powers that be, that's how they treat us. They're aware of the will to meaning. They don't want it going on its own in a maverick way, where you might stumble across something extraordinary, like the works of Ayn Rand or whatever, right? Yeah. Or Meister Eckhart or Jakob Bohm. Or many others. No, they don't want you fucking going anywhere near that. So they have created the monstrous things that we know as the, Islam, Christianity, Orthodox Judaism, all of this nonsense to gather you, to herd you up, to give you, and to make it plausible, they have to throw in some, positive teachings. It's not all black.
Bait in the hook.
Yeah.
It's bait on the hook.
Well, exactly right. Exactly right. Now, they know there'll be a lot of discontents, but then they say, don't worry, we're on the political level, we're going to pull the rug. Also over here, our other buddies, our other bros are pulling the rug. So don't worry that there's certain imperfections, because politically we're going to pull the rug so much that people are, even if some people within these false religions get tired of it, we've always got a surplus of new schmucks to join it. So don't really worry about it. We get some discontents, but they're already going to be in their 50s and 60s. They're out of it anyway. Fuck them. Doesn't matter about them. They're already so jaded, we don't have to worry about them. And they go, hey, this is a great deal. Oh, and by the way, even if they do leave it, hey, we've got Marxism for them. We've got socialism. We got atheism. We got the scientism. These are not mystics. They laugh at the mystics. They laugh at the magicians. Yet they are the dumbest people that ever could exist. They're taking the evidence of the senses. See, the senses, right? 5 senses pick up the material universe, register what we call matter. To base philosophies on matter, the most insubstantial thing, they're telling you that mysticism is insubstantial, that emotion is insubstantial. Their own quantum scientists proved that the more you go towards the material, the more insubstantial it becomes. It almost merges with that which is thought. You stupid, dumbass materialist fools. You've based your paradigms on that which is the most insubstantial thing on the planet, and you presented that as fact. Oh, are you fucking had? Even the most weirdo mystic can say, I got stronger ground than you do. So they're in a total mess, these materialists, doing what they're doing. And you know what's happened? You're not going to believe it. These new neurologists, Mark Solms and the new neurology, is saying that at the center of consciousness, it's feeling, it's emotion. Just now. It's the latest new paradigm. Interoception. I've written about it. They knew it 100 years ago. The mystics were writing about this 100 years ago. But they know that you haven't read that and you don't remember it, so now they've imported it into their neurology and pretending they scrubbed off the names of the earlier people, scribbled their own fucking signatures there and go, see, we've worked it all out. It's not intellect and it's not will. It's emotion. Oh, it'll be great, guys. Give us a fucking Nobel Prize.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I can tell you where this is written 100 years ago, chapter and verse. Word for word. The chicanery of these people is unspeakable. They talk about the mystic, his experiences are hallucinations. The greatest hallucination is trying to tell you that the evidence of your 5 senses is the foundation of all knowledge. That is the greatest hallucination you'll ever have at any time. And they know it now. But they've made the biggest mistake, these materialists, right, by trying to center knowledge, full, complete knowledge of the universe, of what it's all about, answer all mysteries by relying on the evidence of the five senses and the material world? And then only to find out that scientists 10 times smarter than them? The Niels Bohrs, the David Bohms, the Werner Heisenbergs, the Max Plancks, all turned around and said, sorry, it's as insubstantial as anything. And we're not even here talking about the holographic theorists, just talking strictly about quantum scientists overturning the classical paradigms. You see? So how dare they? But for hundreds of years, they've lampooned magic and mysticism. I don't do that. I say that the very holes that you find within those subjects is the evidence that shards are being put together. I expect to see the holes because, according to our little schema there, if you're trying to restore something that's been lost and is in a state of decay, well, it's not going to be perfect. I allow for that. I expect that. See, that's the logical, sane way. But the scientist is a territorializer. He urinates on knowledge. He didn't listen to Immanuel Kant. He didn't listen to anyone who said your work is as insubstantial or it has only a circumscribed, validity. And within that circumference, by all means, go and do what you want. Go and do what you do. But don't you dare presume to tell us that the discoveries that you make in this very finite, phenomenal kingdom are now to be applied universally, when it comes to the fuller picture. If it was, you would not have had any dissenters. There'd be no Alfred North Whiteheads, right? There'd be no Bruce Liptons or Sheldrakes or McGilchrists or any other person dissenting from the higher echelons, and yet we have them in dozens and dozens. Carl Pribben, Henri Bergson. There's, my God, the greatest minds have said, "Oh, you must be. Don't sell me this." Thomas Kuhn, Charles T. Tart. I mean, I could just go on forever. I list these people in my articles and stuff like that, right? Why those dissenters? And there's more coming all the time. The polyvagal theory.
Yeah.
You name it. Yeah. Now we got German New Medicine and all sorts of things. It's non-ending from the dissenters because of the presumptiveness of the mainstream scientism, trying to establish themselves as the font of all knowledge, explaining everything. You got to be kidding. They failed because they overstepped the reach. And in doing so, they pushed smarter people out and said, oh no, we can't accept this. This is way too limited, way too reductionist. But they had their way for, several hundred years. They were able to demonize magic and demonize mysticism, and they've done the world no great service by doing that. And this is me telling you that even I believe that these things have been hijacked by nothing but charlatans. That has to be also borne in mind. And that's a whole other conversation we haven't get into, about that. I've tried to mention it. I refer people to the programs on Gnosticism, on Unslaved, or, Sage versus Psychopath. We've done some very, very good work on that. Because this has been hijacked by very clever people who know that this is an urge within people to, connect with the divine, connect with the truth. And so they've hijacked it. And they're making millions, not just in the mega churches, not just in the evangelical movement, but even in the East. They've all got on board. You'd be amazed at the chicanery of it and what's behind it. So one has to be very, very careful. So that's why in my work, do you know how much I've hurt my own career by constantly quoting others and constantly referring to citations until people think, oh, Tsarion, that's all you do. You have no thoughts of your own. I've even risked that, that backlash. But it's all with this in mind. But when people finally crack what I'm talking about, they're going to need these great thinkers that I cite over and over again. They're going to need them because there has been a campaign of deception going on.
Yeah. No, it's vital. And now the main mistake, the cardinal sin of these scientists, these adherents of scientism, more like, is that they've left consciousness at the door, which I always like how you say and repeat with that. And so that's the main issue. And like, you can go read a thousand different books about science and listen to all the big names in today. How many of them mention consciousness? It's virtually none of them at all. Um, but yeah, well, we're a bit past the 2 hour mark again, so I guess we'll maybe wrap it up at the game there for another week, Michael, if that sounds all right. But that was another banger episode, and we'll have to do a future one, I guess, on the sage and psychopath and the difference in their journeys, because I find that quite fascinating. Maybe a bit about then the work of Wilhelm Reich. So think about more actionable things for people to do. So we'll maybe look at the work of Arthur Yanov and these different ones down the line. But yeah, just once again, have you any final thoughts, Michael, or should we call it there for another week, I think? Yeah.
Well, no, I think there's a good article, The Case for Idealism, another one we could hook up to, that we didn't have time to explore that.
Yeah.
Because idealism is kind of a halfway, to the mysticism. So if mysticism is something a little bit too esoteric for people to jump into straight away and they're floundering, check out idealism. It leads the way. I have a short article that will introduce people to that. I've got much longer presentations on Unslaved, I got a whole thing on idealism, 5 parts. But you see, idealism, it's a good chance that idealism as a philosophy becomes a little bit more prominent in the future, which I'm hoping for personally. Yeah, I mean, it could be hijacked. There's a big, big danger of it being hijacked, just like the others I mentioned. But there's a chance also that, it doesn't. And that some good teachers come forward in the future, that talk about idealism in the right way. I'm highly suspicious, so I don't put that on other people. So hopefully it'll come to bear more. And I would definitely champion that. And it's sort of the idea that both the magician and the mystic can find agreement here, because rather than looking at material matter, dead matter, or accidental happenings, the idea of idealism is that everything you see is a manifestation of consciousness, of thinking, of thought, but not your thought, obviously, but the divine thought. The divine mind has created everything. And so that your mind, the job of your mind, you're also produced by that thinking. And therefore, the job of your mind while you're here on earth is to connect with the divine mind. And that you do through everything that is being created. So remember I said that the magician wants to get up close to everything that has been created? That's his manner, his way of linking with the divine mind. That's what he thinks the intellect is for. And the mystic agrees, in general, with the same principle, that everything is a manifestation of the mind. But rather than go into all the different parts, he wants to condense it by just saying, but all of it is a manifestation of God's love. That's the key element within it all. And I have this element within me that is given to me, by that love, the cosmic love. I have it on my individual level. And so that to me is the key. But both of them are forms of idealism in that sense, so that there's no such thing as dead matter out there. It's one mind connecting with a greater mind. And both the magician and the mystic, both of those contingents would, I think, sign on for that and agree. And all that you're dealing with is 2 different approaches, really. But the idea, and I think Crowley was onto this, is to unite them all. The magical will is to say, I don't want to have one or the other. I want to have both. So, we can leave it there. That's my thoughts on that. Thank you so much, Matty, for letting us explore these ideas. It's been a long time before we've ever been interviewed like this, by anyone. So cheers to you, mate, for this opportunity.
Oh, mate, the pleasure's all mine. No, thank you so much. This is one of the reasons I started the podcast, was to explore these kind of ideas, because I find them so fascinating, and it is the only place on the internet to find them. So make sure everybody's following Michael's work. Make sure you head over to Unslaved, check out each of the articles that we're posting up there, and stay tuned, hopefully, for more to come down the line. So once again, thank you very much, Michael. Thank you for everybody stopping by. Please like and subscribe, and we'll see you all next time. Cheers.